Hello, and welcome to the first of 3 lectures on Australia. So today we'll focus on geography and history, and I'll try to show you why these two fields help us understand some of the issues Australia is currently facing. So the introductory video, being a video to promote tourism in Australia, is obviously only showing the beauty of Australian landscapes, but you also see how diverse they are. We can point out some problems here with these pictures. For instance, in the last screenshot here, you can see a couple scuba diving along the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest coral reef ecosystem and one of the main sources of tourism in Australia. So as you can see here, it's quite long. It's about 2,000 kilometers, 2,300 kilometers, and it's part of the UNESCO World Heritage. But up to 50% of the corals are affected by bleaching, partly because of global warming, and also because of of human activity. So with the bleaching of corals, it means that basically they die, and the ecosystem too. So the Australian government has been investing $2 billion of Australian dollars to try and protect the reef. And for instance, this included a program to stop waste dumping. Also, they try to limit port development, and they also introduced new water cleansing projects. So this is just one of the many environmental challenges Australia has to face today. So a quick word about tourism here. Tourism is being actively promoted in Australia. So you've seen the video. I don't know if you recognize the voice, but it's the voice of one of Australia's big TV stars, Chris Hemsworth, who plays Thor in Vikings. And you see that also in the second video, in my video, that Circular Quay is quite busy with plenty of tourists there. So this is, here are some figures. So you see that there are about 7.4 million visitors, international visitors, coming to Australia. So these were the figures for 2016. And you see that this represents an increase here. And of course, you also see that this means a lot of spending and of revenue for the Australian government. Okay, about $40 billion in revenue. And you see that the main spenders in Australia are its neighbours. So you have people from China, from Japan, from Korea, and also from the US. This is quite logical when you think, for instance, that Australia is about 15,000 kilometers away from France and Europe. Today, it takes a bit more than 24 hours to reach Australia from France. But just imagine what it was like when there were no planes and that Australia was still part of the British Empire. It would have taken months for news and people to travel. In the 1960s, the historian Geoffrey Blainey, B-L-A-I-N-E-Y, developed the notion of the tyranny of distance, explaining that distance was a key concept in understanding the Australian psyche. Because not only was there a huge distance with the mother country, with Britain, but the island itself is huge, as you can see with this postcard here. Australia is the largest island in the world, 7.7 million square kilometers. And the distance are such that people usually fly into land. But remember that Australia only has about 23 million inhabitants. So can you guess why? Australia is sometimes referred to as the dry country. As you can see on this map, which gives you the annual rainfall levels, a significant part of the country receives little to no rain. You can see the difference here with France, where there are no similar areas. Okay, so you see that around Bordeaux you have about 1,100 millimeters a year, and that doesn't happen very often in many areas of Australia. So you might think, all right, it doesn't rain much, but they probably have other water sources, just like we have. And you would be wrong. The main river system is the Murray-Darling Basin, which is situated in the southeast of Australia. So you see the name of some of the main cities here. They've got Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, and Adelaide, and you understand why the white colonists settled there, because there was water. Today, Australia grows about 40% of its agricultural products here, and so of course this creates some new environmental problems. Over the years, there has been an overuse of water in many areas of the Murray-Darling Basin. So the quality of the water has decreased too. A permanent cap, a limit, was introduced in 1997. The cap is a limit imposed on the volume of water which can be diverted from the rivers for other uses such as dams or irrigation. So they are trying to solve the problems, but there are still issues today. This lack of rain is associated with high temperatures. So you see the red center there, the desert. Note here that these are temperatures for December and January, but keep in mind that the seasons are reversed in Australia. This is December, January is summer in Australia, not winter. So with temperatures like this, where did the British settlers go? Yes, you had probably guessed, they settled along the coastline. So this is a map of the population per square kilometre today. So what you can see is that half of the total area of Australia contains only 0.3% of the population. Australians are sometimes referred to as coast huggers, particularly in the eastern seaboard, with relatively high population densities within 50 kilometers of the coast. And they mostly live in big cities. You have the names of the main cities here. Sydney is the largest of them, with a fifth of the population of Australia living in Sydney. You also see the different. You also see Perth here. Perth is the largest city in Western Australia. You also, yes, this is Canberra. So you see that Canberra is just between Melbourne and Sydney. Canberra is the capital of Australia. It was created because both Melbourne and Sydney wanted to become the capital of the country. So they just created another city. You also see on this map the different states. And so you see that Australia has 6 states. So Western Australia, Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. And 2 territories, Northern Territories and the Australian Capital Territory, where you have the capital. One thing is sure is that the structure, the organisation of Australia has changed dramatically since the arrival of the European settlers. So just have a look at this map here. So this is the Aboriginal language map, and it's an attempt to represent all the languages of the different Aboriginal groups in Australia. So just to give you an idea of where people would have lived before European settlement, etc. I'll talk about Indigenous Australia in this 3rd lecture, but just know that they are believed to have reached Australia about 50,000 years ago. But when did Europeans arrive in Australia? So this is a map here of European trade in Asia with trading posts. That's a map of what situation was like in the 17th century. So who do you think reached Australia first? Have a look at the different nations there. I think it was the Dutch, the Spanish, the English, the French, or the Portuguese. The Dutch, yes. You see there that they had the trading posts closer to Australia. So Europeans at the time, they were interested in the exchange of precious metals, of lead, woolen cloth, glass wines and other European goods for tropical products. They carried home pepper, nutmeg, mace, rare spices, tea, indigo, silks, saltpeter. It was really all about trade, not about settling people. So Willem Janszoon, was sent to explore New Guinea to try and find precious metals like gold. And you can see on the map here that he reached the top end of Australia in 1606. The Dutch weren't impressed by what they found. They saw nothing of value, and to make sure that they wouldn't be sent again to Australia, they even said that the Aborigines were man-eaters and things like that. So they made sure that everybody understood that there wasn't anything of interest in Australia. So for a while, the only thing that was known of Australia was the western coast. And as you can see on the map here, Australia was called at the time New Holland. Things changed with James Cook. So James Cook was a British navigator who was sent on a scientific query. He was supposed to observe and record the transit of Venus across the sun in Tahiti. The idea was also to try and find the Great Southern Continent that people at the time thought existed. It didn't. There's no Great Southern Continent. And to try to find new sources of income. So on his way back, he landed in Botany Bay. So you have Botany Bay here. You see where it is there. And so that the type of landscape that he found, there was of course no road at the time. Well, he saw that and he thought, okay, that's not too bad. We could settle there. This is probably the driest season of the year. There must be more rain at other times. And so in his report he said that it was a place where the British could settle. He had everything wrong. This was in fact the wettest season, and this era would have dire consequences for the first settlers, first European settlers. Right, so with this positive report on Botany Bay, the British government decided to create a penal colony, a prison. So there are different theories about this choice. So the first theory is that the goal was to solve a criminal justice system. So before the independence of the United States, Britain would send its convicts to the American colonies. But they had gained their independence and they had nowhere to send their convicts. They tried to send them to Africa. You can see them here. But basically they all died. And obviously, if you want your convicts to die, you just hang them. At the time, that was the idea. The idea of transportation, sending people to other places, was that the convicts would redeem themselves by helping develop new resources for the country. They were not supposed to die. So Botany Bay there seemed to be a good option. There were also military and strategic considerations. There were wars with France, etc., and they thought that it would be a good idea to colonize Australia to make sure that the French didn't precede them. Yes, and I forgot to say that earlier, but when Cook reached the eastern coast, he just claimed it for the British government, so in 1770. And the idea was also that this settling in Australia might create trading opportunity. It would be a stopover on the way to Asia. Right, so I'm just going to let you watch this video on the First Fleet. So the First Fleet, that explained to you everything, but the First Fleet was the first time they sent convicts to Australia. So the Englishmen who had planned the convict colony in Australia had assumed that the soil was fertile. They had assumed that the fall of rain was reliable enough to grow crops, though the assumption was careless, since no Englishman had spent more than a few days in the neighborhood of Botany Bay and Sydney. They also had assumed that a gang of convicts, many of whom had never had physical work, and all of whom had just been confined on cramped ships for most of the previous year, that those convicts could be turned into skilled, energetic farmhands and gardeners with just a flick of the lash. But perhaps the most serious error in the official blueprint for Australia was the misjudging of distance. The seed deteriorated on the long Atwood Passage. The harvests were not satisfactory, and they were very far from other Dutch or British colonies, and so it was very difficult for the convicts at first, because they nearly starved to death. So after a while, things improved, and the settlers needed to find a way to produce wealth. So So if you remember well, you have the map there. So you see the desert, the river system. And what they decided to do, because the land was too dry to grow crops, they decided that the land was good enough for grazing. Okay, so they brought in sheep from Spain or other European countries. And this was a very good idea. It worked very well, and soon wool became one of the main sources of revenue of the colony. The problem is that grazing eroded the soil, which became less and less fertile. Cattle was also imported, and it increased the problem. But cattle and sheep were not the only European species to be imported. Cats and rabbits were also imported. And as you can see on the picture there, this had dire consequences for native species. Okay, so you see a cat here eating a bilby. Some of the native species completely became extinct. You have here the example of the Tasmanian tiger. So really the arrival of the Europeans completely upset the ecosystem. Animals were not the only thing settlers imported from Europe. They also used the same techniques in agriculture. So this meant that they would use clearing. Okay, so they would clear the land. So you see an example here that they could grow crops. But clearing the land again led to erosion, and thus the land was no longer productive. It also led to a rise in the water table, the underground water, the upper limit of the underground water, les nappes phréatiques. And this brought salt in the deep soil, from the deep soil to the surface, and it caused the dryland salinity. And this, of course, means that you can't grow anything there. And the problem is that clearing still continues today. Another important step in Australian history was the gold rush. So you see here Hargreaves, who was the one important figure during the gold rush. So in 1851, gold was found in Bathurst, and what happened is that it attracted lots of migrants. But so you see there, so this is data from today, and you see that there are still mines and deposits of gold and diamonds today. But those are not the only minerals that are to be found in Australia. You also have bauxite, iron ore, etc. Those are very important exports for Australia. You also have, and that's very important in terms of environmental issues, you also have coal. So Australia is a leading producer of minerals for the world, and it produces 19 minerals in significant amounts. Minerals are produced in all states, okay, so except, and even in the Northern Territory, just not in the ACT. And they are an important part of the Australian economy, accounting for about 10% of gross domestic product. So, as you can guess, the mining industry is fairly influential in Australia, and with minerals like coal, the industry is pouring methane gas into the atmosphere. So greenhouse gas emissions are another big issue for Australia. You see there that Australia is the first emitter of greenhouse gases per capita. And the pressure of the mining industry makes it difficult for the government to actually intervene. Let's get back to our gold rush. So the gold rush was a migrant magnet, as you can guess. And on the graph you have to analyze, or you had to analyze, you might have seen that during this era, the ships took a different route, a faster route, and a more dangerous route. The gold rush also saw the arrival of the first Chinese in important numbers since the arrival of the Europeans in Australia. So most of them returned home after the gold rush, and you can see that some of them stayed. So just to give you the figures there, between 1852 and 1889 there were about 40,000 arrivals and 36,000 departures. As you probably know, the Chinese weren't welcome in Australia. As you can see, this is a cartoon to show you the fear of the Chinese. They were referred to as the Yellow Peril. So what happened is that the colonies, which had been developing fairly independently, each had its own military, its own railways, etc. So they were fairly independent from one another. But because of this Asian threat, they decided to unite and to become the Commonwealth of Australia. So the Commonwealth of Australia was proclaimed on January 1st, 1901. So just to give you here an idea of the reasons why they created this Commonwealth of Australia, this new country. Okay, so this is an editorial from the Sydney Morning Herald, which is one of the main Australian newspapers. Any right-thinking white man needs federation to keep out the foreign races. A vote for federation is a vote for white Australia. Okay, so all this period up to the 1970s is often referred to as white Australia in terms of immigration, white Australia policy. The Labour Party, so the left-wing party, in 1901 was stating, our chief plank is, of course, a white Australia. There's no compromise about that. The industrious coloured brother has to go and remain away. But how were they going to keep the Asians away? I'll let you pause there if you want to, but the main idea is that the Australians wanted to put in words clearly that they didn't want any Asians, but the British government said that this wasn't possible because the British government thought that such a move would upset the Japanese, the Indians, etc. So instead of clearly banning the Asians, they implemented the dictation test. So the dictation test was administered by customs officers at ports around Australia. Most people coming to Australia were not required to take the test, but those who were identified as undesirable immigrants were required to write out a passage of 50 words. Well, where a person spoke English well, the test could be given in another language. Those who failed the test were refused entry or deported. In the early years of its operation, nearly everyone who took the test failed. And after 1909, no person passed the test. To give you an example of how widespread this idea that Australia needed to remain white and British was, just have a look at this slide. So this is a picture of a board game where basically the goal of the game was to get the coloured men out and the white men in. Asians were not the only victims of this type of legislation, with this idea that they needed to maintain a white empire. Pacific Islanders, like the Kanakas, were also forced to leave Australia. Some of them hadn't had any choice, so they had been kidnapped from the island to come and work as farmhands. But after the legislation was passed, they had to go back to their islands. Things changed after World War II. This is the era often referred to as populate or perish. So in 1945, you have 7 million inhabitants in Australia. And what happened was that Darwin, in the north of Australia, was attacked by the Japanese during World War II. And the Australians realized that they couldn't rely on the British to help them, that they had to find their own solution. So, after World War II, the Australian government developed a sustained immigration program. Its purpose was first to meet labour shortages, to protect Australia from external threat, and to create prosperity. The first boats of people, they included many people from the Middle East or from the Mediterranean, and the Australian didn't welcome them. So I'm just going to let you listen to the immigration speech of Caldwell, who was the first immigration minister in Australia. You see how he's trying to convince the population that they really need more people. So from 1945 to 1975, they tried really to attract as many British people as they could. So of the 1.5 million British immigrants who arrived in Australia in that time, most came out as the result of an assisted passage scheme. So the British who arrived that way were often referred to as £10 POMs, because they only had to pay £10 for the passage. The full fare was closer to £75, £75, sorry. So really, this assisted passage was a very good deal. You also had the program Bring a Britain in 1957 to try to attract British people. But this wasn't enough. So I'm just going to let you watch this other excerpt here. So this is what Caldwell decided. So he couldn't attract enough British people. But what he would do is that he would try and attract the Bulls. So the new migrants wouldn't be British, but they would be white, they would be healthy, and of course they would be beautiful. Progressively, the restriction on Asian immigration were lifted. In 1947, the non-European population of Australia, excluding indigenous people, was of just 0.25% of the entire population. So this means that only one person out of 400 was from a non-European background. But despite Australia's White Australia policy, a number of non-European people came to Australia from the 1950s. They did so under the Colombo Plan, which was an arrangement between various countries to improve the standards of living and education in developing Asian countries. By the 1980s, more than 20,000 people had come from Asia to study in Australian institutions under this scheme. The second step was the end of the dictation test in 1958. In the 1970s, refugees from Asia began to arrive, because as a signatory to the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, Australia is obligated to accept people from other countries who classify as refugees. The first influx of refugees from Asia came from Vietnam after the end of the Vietnam War. Then in 1973, The White Australia policy officially ended with the federal government vowing to not to use race as a factor in selecting migrants. So this was reflected in the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act, which made it illegal to use race as the basis for any official purpose. So the dictation test was replaced by a points-based system. Okay, so you see, I want you to pause here to have a look at the different criteria. There, so the more points you get, the easier it is to be accepted in Australia. So this is to show you the population today. So what you need to keep in mind is that 28% of the population of Australia is born abroad. The figure for France is 12%. And you see here the different countries of birth. And you see that today, China, people come from China, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, in important numbers. This multicultural dimension of Australia is reflected in this graph there. You see the languages spoken at home, and you see here the increase of the Mandarin, okay, and of other Asian languages. So multiculturalism is in fact an official policy of Australia. So it includes some obligations, like accepting basic principles of Australian society, like the rule of law, democracy, freedom of speech, etc. You need to commit to Australia and to its interests. You need to respect the right of others to express their views and values. So this is for the obligation part, but you also have rights. Okay, you have the right to express and share your individual cultural heritage, including your language and your religion. In terms of social justice, you have the right to equality of treatment and opportunity. And in terms of economic efficiency, of course, you should only be selected or hired on your skills and not on the way you look. Okay, so things are not perfect, as you can see on this infographic document. You see that 1 in 5 Australians have experienced race hate talk, and also that only 86% of Australians support action to tackle racism. Okay, so there are still some racial tensions. So I'm just going to refer here to an event that occurred more than 10 years ago. But there's quite a clear video here to explain you what happened, so I'll let you watch it. So basically what happened was that lifesavers were attacked by people of Middle Eastern appearance, and after that there was some backlash. There were demonstration against immigration from the Middle East, etc. So I'll let you just have a look at this video here. Today, the main issues in terms of immigration remains the way the refugees are treated. Refugees are sent to islands relatively far from Australia. You see Manus Island, Nauru, while their situation is being processed. So you see the type of island it is, you also see their living conditions. Some of them stay several years. So just imagine if you are a young kid, what you would feel like if you had to live for several years under these conditions. Okay, so I'll stop here for my first lecture on Australia. Thank you.